It's, but it's funny, you know, it's been a theme in British history for such a long time, and I think it's connected. I'm sure that the internet revolution that happened in Silicon Valley could not have happened here, because that so much involved people who were not in the least qualified to do things, doing them, starting up industries that nobody had ever heard of, or moving from a discipline like biology into computer graphics or something like that. Just people making wild moves across the landscape of the intellectual landscape of the time. And I think here it would have been regarded with quite raised eyebrows. You know, it's rather suspicious that he couldn't have been very good at that if he's now decided to do this sort of feeling.
But you know, it's interesting because, of course, I would say your career, a lot of which has taken place here, not in the sciences. You're not a scientist in addition to being an artist and musician, are you? That you have been associated with periods here where there have been at least cultural kind of waves of innovation that have happened. Like, is there something in those? Are there common principles, do you think, in the kind of coffee house culture and in those spaces in the kind of creative arts?
Well, there's a couple of scenes I've been involved with that were very fruitful, and one of them was quite specifically English, and that was the period at the end of the 60s when art schools became the places where most of the interesting new music was being made. Cornelius Cardew, of course, was at the centre of that, Gavin Bryars, and then actually a lot of Americans, because a lot of American composers who were coming over here, like Cage, Norton Feldman, Christian Wolff, so on, couldn't get any work at all in music schools. Music schools were absolutely uninterested in what they were doing. It was the art schools that they came to and they taught that. And that was because the art students at that time were starting to feel that there was some kind of breakdown of boundaries between the various arts. So it was thought possible to move easily between them, since what we were interested in at that time was processes and concepts rather than products. That was the sort of the rubric at the time anyway. And so there was a very interesting period where really most of the interesting music that was being made in the experimental music area, it was not coming from composers who'd been trained as composers and musicians. It was coming from other people. And there was a thing called the Scratch Orchestra, which I was a part of. The Scratch Orchestra was at its strongest, I guess, about 80 people, as I said, mostly art students, who came from different colleges around England and worked with Cornelius Cardew and begun to develop a sort of sociological approach to making music. So most of the things that we were doing were to do with forms of cooperation between people. So it was very much a think tank about how cooperation happens, what you need to make cooperation work. And Cardew wrote a beautiful piece called The Great Learning, which had one section called Paragraph 7, which is really one of the most economical and beautiful cooperative enterprises that anybody can do. It's for any group of singers or non-singers, and really worth trying sometime. I've written about it fairly often because I think it's one of the great overlooked pieces of music, actually. And it's essentially an experiment in society, an experiment in how societies can work. What's the minimum amount of constraint and organisation that you need to make an identifiable social group do something together? That's what that experiment is. Because it's a piece of music, it hasn't captured the attention of sociologists and anthropologists, who are the people who should be looking at it, I think.
And what were the rules? What were the rules that, I mean, you were talking about kind of the lessons for how you create that. So what you, are there...
Well, I can explain that piece because I think it's worth explaining, because it's so economical. First of all, it's for any group of people, so we could do it together. Shall we? No. We could. I have done it with an audience before, and it was quite successful. It was an audience of 6,000 people in San Francisco. we did the biggest ever performance of that piece. So you take a group of people, and there's a text which came from Confucius, which is divided up into short single words or phrases. The first word is if, then the next line is the root, the third line is be in confusion, nothing will be well governed. And then there's another paragraph. And beside each line there's a little number. It says 11, for example, and then it says 2F. So it means you sing that line 11 times, and 2 of those times you sing it loudly. And each line has that beside it. And you sing for the length of a breath. Of course, that means that each person sings for a different length of time. So you choose your first note randomly, and at the end of you stick to that note for singing that line. So you sing if 11 times with that note. At the end of the line, when you reach the end, you choose your next note from your surroundings. So you choose a note that you can hear somebody else singing. And that's the rules. As simple as that. And what you get from that is an extremely interesting piece of music, which, even given those very simple rules, is totally identifiable, has a real personality and character, is great fun to do, and follows a very interesting trajectory, because it starts with total chaos, because everyone's singing random notes. But of course people find it hard to sing out of tune, most of them. So it starts with chaos, and it very quickly adjusts as people tune themselves. So it resolves quite quickly to a very complex chord, and then it thins down. And there's some very interesting things that govern the notes that remain. And those are to do with things like the shape of the room, because the room will reinforce some harmonics more than others. So after a little while, the thing starts to have a dominant tone, which is actually based on the dimensions of the room. So this piece not only encapsulates some sort of idea of a society at work with a minimum of constraints. My first political interest was anarchism, so I was always interested in what are the minimum constraints that you can get away with. And that continues to be an interest of mine, actually, in everything I've done. What's the minimum you have to do to make something work? It's called laziness in other cases.
Back to the dilettante.
Yes. So it has this social thing going on, but it also has this fact of fitting itself to its environment. So it grows into the shape of the group of people who are doing it and the shape of the room that it's in.
The other thing